going to say, that's why I was standing here. Invite you to return to your seats. Dean, Heather, if you could bring up some towels. Dean, Heather, would you please grab some, or somebody bring up some paper towels? Towels are coming. Right. Thank you. All right. It is a delight to welcome Arienne Davison from the Diocese of Olympia to be with us. I first met you years ago. Yes.
A long, long time ago.
And at the time, I was just so impressed with her wisdom and her ability to be wise, be kind, invite me to be a better person than sometimes I want to be. And really, just she's such a good teacher and knows so much. And so there's been a number of times that I've said, you got to come and do things with us. And she's helped us with clergy conference before, with College for Congregational Development. And I'm like, okay, we need you back. So I am so delighted you're here and able to do the program for us this year. And so with no other further ado, Arienne Davison.
Boop, boop. Now it's on. Oh, there we go. It is such a pleasure to be with you here in the Diocese of Spokane. As a fellow Washingtonian and Episcopalian, it has just always filled my heart with joy to be with all of the different parts of our beautiful state, all of the different climates that God made, all of the different communities and the different ways we live. And it was a wonderful treat to drive. I actually drove so that I could remember those long car trips as a child and see how things have changed and what hasn't. And so thank you for that opportunity to come visit again another beautiful corner of God's creation here in the church. So I am here to talk about culture and the ways we can think about culture that might help our ministries in the world and help us to be better neighbors. But I think it's good to start at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can get when we're thinking about something as foundational as culture. So I want to read a story, one of our earliest stories from the Bible, and it comes from Genesis. And I think you'll recognize this one. And you can read along on the slide if you want, as I read it aloud. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which mortals had built, and the Lord said, "Look, they are one people." and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they purpose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth. And they left off building the city. Therefore, it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Now, I have for a long time thought about this story as mostly a story about idolatry. Look at these people who could build something so big and fine and be so proud of themselves, that this was the main thing that God was mad at. So probably for 10 or 15 years, that was the main thing I assumed was happening in this story. But over the last few years, I've been thinking about this story in different ways. The more I've learned about how we teach each other how to be human, because I see some artifacts of these ways we learn how to be human in this story. In this story about God's beginning with us, human beings were charged with wonder and care for creation. They were supposed to tend this corner of earth together in comity. Instead, they build things to protect themselves. And they do it in a way that is not adaptive and doesn't match all of the people and doesn't match all of the terrain around them. And so when the humans in the story rely too much on this one way of being and doing, this one language, this one way of building buildings, God scatters them. You can't just do this one way. God orders people to develop different ways of being human when they are in different places around the earth or with different people to whom God has sent them. And when I think more about this, all of a sudden, some of those prophetic stories, those stories in the Bible, in the Old Testament, about God's people in captivity, when God's people were taken from their home to a different place. And now, instead of building big buildings, the struggle of God's people in captivity is staying different, not becoming one with the culture of Babel, but remaining distinct as God's people. And it's this insight that's caused me to wonder more and more if this story is not just a rejection of idolatry, but a rejection of making our culture an idol. The way we live is the only way. And God says, nope, I scatter you. In 2010, I watched this movie. I don't know if anybody saw this. If you just want a shot of cute, it's not terrible. But this movie followed 4 children from very different parts of the world: California, Mongolia, Japan, and Namibia. And what we learn from watching this movie is that while all of these children have some things in common, they're little humans, they cry, they're hungry, you have to change whatever comes out, whatever you catch, whatever comes out of them, and you have to clean that up. But each family has really, really different ways of responding to their child's needs. When the kid's hungry, they do different things. When the kid cries, they do different things. They have different ways of disciplining their children. Some of them give a swat on the hiney. Some of them use words. They teach emotional expression or regulation to their kids. Sometimes when the kids are loud and boisterous, it's encouraged. And in some of these families, when kids are loud and boisterous, it's discouraged. And each family finds ways to help their child overcome the challenges they find in their environment. Intercultural interaction, and that is when we interact with someone from a different culture. If I were to interact with the parents from Namibia, or the parents from Japan. And I wanted to talk about parenting. My interaction with them would only be considered competent if it was appropriate and effective. When I say appropriate, I mean an interaction that doesn't violate another person's understanding of what it means to be a good person. Right? All of us were taught a way to be a good person. When I'm interacting with someone else, it's only really appropriate if they think I'm doing that right. And if I'm not, they might see I'm being disrespectful or bad or mean. Our goal in intercultural communication and ministry is to be appropriate with the people we're trying to serve. And our secondary goal is to be effective in our ministries. We want to accomplish a goal with someone who isn't like us. Maybe it's the transformation of their life through relationship with Jesus. Whatever our goal is, if we want to make an impact and have an effective communication, one that we both get something out of, we have to then mind that it's appropriate and effective. So I want to flag here, this is a big warning sign, because this is a thing that comes up whenever we talk across cultures. And that is, I mentioned this word appropriate, and I said words like respect, good, bad, right, wrong. When we're having intercultural interactions, it's important for us to remember that we're talking to someone who has a different frame of what constitutes right and wrong ways of doing things. Not like evil and good. I'm actually talking about like whether you put the toilet paper facing over the roll, under the roll. The reality is, well, we might have strong opinions. Neither one is more or less respectful unless the other person thinks it's not. Right? Yeah. So we don't just have a culture. We perform or act on the culture we've been taught. We act it out. And then that means we have to choose what parts we act out and what parts we don't. And that also means other people can always see what we're doing, even if we don't realize we're doing it. This is sort of the inverse of unconscious bias. Have you ever heard that phrase? Unconscious bias, this idea or implicit bias that we're projecting some things onto people when we interact with them based on their groups. The flip side is people are seeing us. They're judging us. And if we're not mindful of that, we don't have control over it. So when our communication goal includes earning others' trust and understanding, the other person decides if our performance of culture is close enough to theirs to be appropriate. Some people will describe this idea as intent versus impact. I might intend to perform the right way for you. I might intend to wear the right outfit, but I might not realize that if I wear this one color, it's incredibly offensive for some reason I don't know, right? It's your choice. If I don't know that and I walk into the room, I could have done better homework. Or I can say I'm sorry. But it's the other person who's going to decide if I've been offensive or not. I don't get to decide that because I'm not the one who's listening. So now that we've thought about this important remembering that culture is this powerful foundational understanding we have that we carry around with us, you might still say to yourself, why are you talking about this? This is not particularly Christian, Arienne, and you are a priest. You might say, why would we do secular tests like the IDI to try and improve our ministry? And I would argue that this way of seeing the world helps us understand who we are, our culture, and it helps us understand other people better. It helps us understand who Jesus was better. It helps us understand who the gathered body of Christ in our congregation is better. It helps us understand who our neighbors are better. And I know in this year, as you've been engaging in deep deep listening to God, to one another in your congregations, and to your neighbors, I have this strong hunch that you have come across moments where you have realized there is some there to you, to your congregation. That there is culture, that thing you feel, that way of doing things, that connection. Some of that, if you understand it better, you can share it better. So I also want to talk about how a lack of intercultural skills can lead to things that we don't like, particularly cultural polarization. Now, when we talk about polarization these days, we're really thinking about our politics. You know, maybe debates or which cable channel you watch. And the thing about cultural polarization and even political violence is, as Billie Holiday sang, the Bible says, but it still is news. We have been doing these things as long as there have been people. And the story of Jesus and his life reflects the same sort of violent political polarization that we fear today. So if we think back to Jesus' birth, he's born in a kingdom that is occupied by Rome. And there are people who are part of his culture, that are in leadership, that are working with an occupying power. And there are a whole bunch of different groups in the culture that have different ways of understanding that difference, of making sense of it, and different reactions. And so we can actually see in this first century culture some of the same polarization dynamics that I think we're experiencing today. So just to think back, let me tell you about some groups that were part of Jesus's lifetime. There were these Roman governors, right? Like Pontius Pilate in the story is the governor. There's Herod, who's a king, who has to do what Rome wants. They're taxing people, and there's a government. So there were groups like religious sects, say the Essenes. They're a group of believers who keep the old stories of the Hebrew scriptures, and they actually also record the first examples of our gospels. When the oldest examples of our Christian texts were found in these caves. And the only reason we have them is because some doomsday folks who thought the world was ending hid the stories in the caves. Their response to this violent political polarization was to go and hide, to keep the story as well as they could, as long as they could. There were other people who took a more active role in trying to change politics. We hear in the scriptures about zealots, and we're not just talking about that as an adjective. This is an actual political group who believed that political violence was warranted to throw off the Roman occupation. So there's some people who think Barabbas was a zealot, right? So there are people who are actually using political violence to get their way in Jesus's time. And this is one of the things people wonder about Jesus. Is he one of those? Are his people the violent people? We hear a lot in the Gospels about Pharisees. And I think many people in Sunday school learn that the difference between Pharisees and Sadducees is that the Sadducees were sad, you see, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. But that is actually not the only difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees as a group were sort of like a middle class. They were mostly in Jerusalem and those surrounding territories. They were the civil servants. They were the ones who kept the temple going, and their livelihood depended on the system working. They were more comfortable because they were gathered and had resources, a little more educated. Maybe that's why they weren't as worried about a bodily resurrection. Who knows? There were also other people called Sadducees, right? There were Pharisees, or the Sadducees were concentrated in the cities. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were all over the place. We heard Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee, was wandering around the countryside helping stone Christians. Pharisees believed that if people would just return to a literal reading of the Torah, their lives would be restored, their faith and culture would be restored. And so they acted that out by policing other people in their communities and making sure they did it right. And after Jesus' death and resurrection, by the end of the first century, there's Jesus movement Jewish people. People who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, who share the same cultural artifacts as the Essenes, the Zealots, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. Jesus lived in a culturally and politically polarized society, just like we do. Individuals and groups use strategies and skills navigating cultural differences, religious and political differences to accomplish their ends. Some of those cultures continue to exist, like ours. We have inherited a part of this fight. Some of those cultures, like Rabbinic Judaism, continue, which is really a resolution of the difference between Pharisaic and Sadducee Judaism. And some die. The Essenes don't exist. All we have are these records, these artifacts of who they are and what they believed, and the clues of what they did, and the stories of the people who did violence. So when I think about polarization, about the things that are making it hard for us to do ministry, to be good neighbors, it's helpful to think about what we see, what kind of things are happening in a polarized society in our social dynamics so that we can start to disrupt them. I know some people, I heard 55 people showed up this morning to learn a little bit more about granular ways to interrupt that process in conversation. But let's think on some different levels. If we're in a polarized society, it's likely that we're going to see individuals, small groups, and even large groups, like, I don't know, a denomination, focusing their cultural energy, their mission, on judging other people's behavior as bad or good, right or wrong, respectful, disrespectful. And I think we see a lot of this policing of language and behavior in our wider culture right now. And that's actually not one political or religious denomination side. It's just easier to tell people they're right or wrong than to figure out solutions that are mutually beneficial. And when you get there, you're going to see these polarization dynamics and ineffectiveness. It's also true then in these cultures that are more polarized, we would expect to see people loudly and coercively punishing bad behavior. Like if they think it's bad, it's easier to hurt people more in a polarized society because we're distracted. We're focusing on what is right and wrong and not our flesh, the sanctity of life, the connections between us. And when we do that, it's easier to do violence and hurt each other. People in a polarized society where we're thinking in this binary way are more likely to use stereotypes. They're more likely to say, if you're part of some group, that must mean you behave this way. When that might not be the best way to learn about how people are going to behave and treat them. So we are going to talk more now about intercultural development because we all have cultures and we're all interacting with people that are a little bit different than us and also have a lot in common with us. And so we're going to talk about some theory, and you took a test, an instrument, so that we could all learn how we think about things as a group. So when we vote on things, when we pick people to lead us, this will give hopefully some insight into some of the things that we're bringing to that, the frames, the ways of seeing the world. And then once we know what those are, we'll have control and we can decide what we want to do with that information. But it's important for me to assert now that when we talk about intercultural development or culture, I do come from a social science background as well as a theological background. So I think that there's such a thing as right and wrong. I want to be super clear about that. I also am not sure I'm the best one to decide. And I want to be really humble about my judgments and check them out with a lot of other people. And so a thing I would invite us all to do is to take a less judgmental stance towards ourselves and each other. Because one of the things when we do this work that almost always comes up is that we realize we could have done better. And staying in a place where we're fixated on what we could have done better can take the energy that we need to do better. And I want us to do better. So, this is my favorite part because, briefly at least, I'm going to stop talking. So, I would like for you to get out your program booklets. It should look like this one. Program packet. This packet is not a test, so it's really for you. The way I've worked this out is that there's going to be a bunch of opportunities for you to reflect on how, as we go, your culture, your congregation's culture, and your relationship with Jesus interact. And so this is the first set. And this is really hoping to get us think about who we are as churches or as a diocese. So every one of our churches began as a group of people who wanted to gather and pray in a very particular way. Each one of our churches at some point decided to follow the constitutions and canons of the Episcopal Church. Every congregation, I bet, has served like whatever is your congregation's best special treat at coffee hour regularly for as long as you've been a parish. And every congregation here has members who have learned the best way to be a part of that congregation, which means every member here, I think, has some ability to understand the culture of their congregation. So this is a chance for you to think about that culture. And we're going to practice in these questions, thinking about our congregation as a group of people with a culture that do something together, that have things in common. And we also want to start noticing visible, behaved differences at church. So just as an example, if I were thinking about what people have in common, I might focus on things I can actually see, not like we're all really nice. Like maybe, but that's harder for me to like visually imagine. So maybe you would actually think about things like, most people at our church drive to church. Now, if me saying that, you're like, well, every church is like that. I would say, but no. Even if you think like, oh, every church is like that, if your church has a thing in common, I will tell you there are some churches in dense neighborhoods where everybody walks or takes transit. So whatever the thing about your church is, try and make it something you could actually record, like in a video camera or take on a survey, right? An actual thing you could describe. Another example might be most people at my church wear jeans to church, right? I'm sure that there's at least one here that's true. But I bet there's also one here where, ooh, don't do that. So the goal here is to start thinking through then values you think we might have in common, and then behaviors you see in your congregation in common. And then in the next two questions, you'll be thinking about differences in values or behaviors, and maybe what you have in common and differently from your neighbors around the church too. So we're going to take 20 minutes. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to write notes. I will tell you when those 5 minutes are up, and then you'll have about 15 minutes to talk in your group. All right, take some notes. I am aware that those are big questions and I gave you little time. However, you have more time at any time after this to think more about those questions, but you only have this time to talk to the people at your table about them. So for the next 15 minutes, it says congregations, but that's because I didn't know how the tables were going to be arranged. So please, if you wouldn't mind, have a conversation with folks at your table about any surprises, things you noticed about answering these questions. Did you focus on similarity or difference? What sort of examples? Maybe that might be a thing that comes up. But have some time and talk about your responses to these questions at your table, and you'll have 15 minutes. Nothing more exciting for a teacher than to hear people talking about the questions. So thank you for making my evening that way. Now that we've had a chance to think about similarities and differences in our Christian communities, we have an opportunity to learn about our orientation towards similarity and difference as measured by your IDI results. And so we're going to be talking about that for the next little bit. So as individuals, we develop over time in a lot of ways. Physically, intellectually, so there's models for human physical development, human intellectual development, human faith development. And there's models for human intercultural development. Those skills that are developed over time, just like in our physical development, we roll over, crawl, walk, ride a bike. So it is important then to think about these skills, intercultural skills, as skills. They are things we learn. They're not things some good people just have and other bad people don't. Right? These are things we have to practice and get good at, just like any other kind of human development. So it's also true, besides that we're all developing, that when we gather in groups, and humans are profoundly social animals, whatever skills most of the people have in that group, that's where we spend our intercultural energy. So if we're at a certain level of skill, most of us, like just because that's where the most of the energy, the majority of the way of thinking is, we're going to tend to behave that way. And this makes sense, like if I got a group of carpenters together, they're probably more likely to build bookcases than play jazz. They might be really great, right? But the group, the thing they have in common is wanting to work wood, not make music. And that means that when we're at church, if most of us are good at knowing, or if we are good at knowing how to be good at praying, but we're not especially curious about how other people pray. We will keep praying the way we learned to pray instead of talking to our neighbors. We do what is easiest, the least awkward thing. So that might not be what Jesus has called us to do. In fact, I would argue it's not what Jesus called us to do. Start moving that way is to learn about those developmental orientations towards similarity and difference. So now you're going to see a scale. And what you're going to see, there we go. What you're going to see is a development of different skills along this continuum. And what you'll notice in general is we'll move towards monocultural ways of viewing the world, not noticing differences, having one thing, judging differences, my thing is best, de-emphasizing differences, we all have a thing, acceptance, I wonder what your thing is, and bridging across difference, let's build some things together. So as we move, we go from less complex ways of seeing people and their social reality to more complex ways of seeing other people's social reality. In monocultural mindsets, we're most likely to use stereotypes, remembering that stereotypes are assumptions. It's when we say Arienne is part of a group, Asian women. That means she must behave like I think Asian women behave, bad driver, let's say, right? That would be an assumption or a stereotype based on my group membership. If, however, you said that Arienne, she does this weird thing where she tells this long winding story and I'm supposed to get the point, and then she just stops talking, you might think to yourself, actually, there's a lot of research that says people from East Asian cultures tend to use more indirect styles of communication. They might tell stories instead of getting to the point or talk to other people or use symbols. Maybe that's what Arienne is doing, I might think to myself. That would be a generalization. You notice the difference between an assumption and a hypothesis? One is like, there's some research that suggests this. I want to test that hypothesis out. And one is really us saying, oh, you look like this. This must be how you are. It's also true that as we move from monocultural to intercultural mindsets, we move from an inward focus on our own culture to an increasing focus outside of ourselves. So now, let's talk about these individual developmental orientations that were on that scale. The first is denial. And this is an orientation in which people understand their own culture very well, but maybe withdraw from others when differences are overwhelming. And so folks who are in the who use a denial way of managing similarity and difference are just so overwhelmed by differences, they retreat into the safety of their own culture. The skill that people develop when they're in denial, and all of us were once, is that we start to understand what our culture group thinks being a good person is. And we start to get good at working with that. So you can be a very good person and be in denial as long as you never have to navigate differences. Like it's just like two of you and you're the same, right? Twins, right? You could be a great person. You just wouldn't know what to do when something was different. But once you know, hey, I really get how to be good at my culture. Like, I'm a part of this group. You start to look around and notice that we're not all the same. There's visible differences between how we are. Like, some people wear different outfits than others or eat different foods. And when we get to that point, we've gained the skill of really being good at our own culture, but we start to do another thing, which is judge. So we move towards polarization. And polarization is a judgmental orientation that views differences between us and them. So the thing to keep in mind when we're talking about polarization is that these are people who can, if they choose to, perform their own culture well. But what they're focused on is differentiation and judging right and wrong. So an important thing to notice about polarization is that it can take two forms, right? Because if you have a binary, you can think of it as a scale, right? Like there's two different things that are happening. And when you're in polarization, sometimes you say us is good and them is bad. But sometimes you say the opposite. Like them is great, we stink, right? And this is a cultural practice like we see in teenagers. If any of you have teenagers around you, they are just trying on identities and dissing on other identities and differentiating themselves from one another. And it flips, right? It can flip just like that. So in Western Washington, I don't know if this is true, but I know a lot of Episcopalians who are white and they are progressive, right? And so they often, those folks, when I work with them, I've noticed a pattern that sometimes those folks are in polarization reversal about their racial and ethnic identity. They feel like being white isn't great right now. And so they push that away, right? Like they disidentify from that or just don't like it, talk about how it's not great. Those same people are still in polarization when they say, you know what's great though? The Episcopal Church and its inclusion. And you know what stinks? Those churches that aren't inclusive. They're so backwards. We're so great. So what I would argue is like, regardless of the moral claim, one way or the other, notice that the way of thinking is the same. That's how we get into trouble. We're doing the same operation, but our judgments are different, and you cannot reconcile that. In fact, that's a really unstable way to be over time. So most people then move out of it. But before we get to the next slide, I think it's important to notice here and in the next developmental orientation that whether you are a person who is overvalued, like someone who has been told who you are, like you have more access to jobs and housing and education and social capital, if you're one of those people, you will experience polarization differently than someone who has been told you are not what we want. You do not have access to jobs or housing or the things that we think people should have. You're going to experience polarization really differently. And my hunch is you will judge people in polarization, whether they are majority culture or minority culture, differently. Like you might think someone who is, I'll just leave it at that. Polarization is tricky. The key thing to remember is when you do polarization ways of thinking, you're judging and differentiating. When we move to minimization, we start to focus on similarities and universal values in ways that can miss and mask the really important differences. Now, remembering that polarization was about differentiation and judging, and remembering it does feel adolescent and stressful and conflicted to always be differentiating. So most people move into minimization, which helps us get away from the conflict that comes from navigating differences and judging them so harshly, towards being more tolerant as long as we accept this one kind of normal way of being human, this thing we have in common. So the skill that folks in minimization have is that they can tolerate different ways of being in my culture. Like I can tolerate different ways of being like me. You can be a different kind of Episcopal priest than me. I'm tolerant, right? And I might even be tolerant of people in other cultures. Like you can be a deacon however you want to, or a bishop. It's cool. It's great. But I might, if I think, oh yeah, that's fine, we can all just be different, I might miss that, like, it's different to be a bishop than a priest, or to be a deacon and a priest, or to be a lay person and a bishop, right? These are all things that are going to feel really different. So the challenge for folks in minimization is to start notice meaningful differences, starting to notice those meaningful differences in a non-judgmental, compassionate, and curious way. So an important thing to know about minimization too is that unlike these other developmental orientations, and this will become more clear when you see results, for each one of those other phases like denial and polarization, they kind of occupy, so both denial and minimization occupy the same number of scores on the scale. So it's like 15 points for denial, like if it's like how I say this, like a 60 to 140 point scale. It's like 15 points for denial, 15 points for polarization. All of a sudden, when you get to minimization, it's like 30 points. You could score all this whole range in the middle, and you would still be in minimization. And the reason is that when you're doing this work, there's two things you actually have to learn. The first is cultural self-integration, which is you have to learn the specifics of your own culture, who taught you that culture, how they taught you that culture, and become curious about your own culture. You also have to learn to tolerate different ways of being in your own culture, like I said, right? You have to realize that there's not one way to be whatever it is you think you are. And I would call that in-culture perspective taking. Like I can recognize if we're in the same group that we don't have to think exactly the same or perform exactly the same. But again, the challenge in that phase is that it's the majority that regulates what everyone has in common. So if you're not a part of that norm, then you just don't have as much say and your experience matters less. So when we grow, we start to grow towards tolerance. And that's the second phase of minimization. So we're learning how to tolerate those different ways of being human, particularly other cultures, and we're starting to become curious about other ways of being human. So this is about having cultural integrity. Having some confidence that you know what your own culture is and what parts you perform and what parts you won't. So this is also where, when I said sometimes worrying about how badly we've done takes energy away from being better, this is actually a primary issue for folks in minimization, because often it's easier to not engage in growth when we can just kind of coast on what we have in common. And if we aren't confident enough, we will never have the awkward conversation because of how easy it is to stay there. If, however, we manage to get over that hump, become really confident that I know how to be myself in my culture with other people, and I can be with other people, and now I'm actually kind of wondering what's going on now that I'm here. That's when I'm starting to approach an acceptance orientation, one that is curious and appreciative. I would call this intercultural perspective taking, the ability to put on the lens of another culture and see a little bit more through that way of being human, those eyes. But the challenge is that seeing is not the same as like knowing what to do. So our skill is appreciation and curiosity about other cultures, but the challenge is knowing what to do in intercultural situations. The good thing is, if we're curious and we put ourselves in those situations, we tend to grow. We tend to start figuring stuff out, because if we're faithful and really are trying, people will correct us in gentle ways, and then we'll learn how to behave. So the final orientation that folks can arrive at on this scale is called adaptation. This is an orientation that's about that shifting of perspective and changing behavior in culturally appropriate ways. And so for this one, the skill is I can empathize with, understand, and work well with at least one other culture. Right? So you have a primary culture. When you took the assessment, it said, think about that culture. And if you scored an adaptation, it meant that with at least one other significant cultural group that you were thinking about, you both can see kind of how they're coming at the world. And also when you interact with those folks, they'll probably find you appropriate and effective. The thing about development, though, is it never stops. And actually, the thing I love about a developmental scale like this is actually the challenge continues for folks in adaptation to increase the number of culture groups you work well with. So if you get really good at being an inclusive, welcoming community to LGBTQ folks, you might find that you still have a racial divide that you need to work on. And if you get really good inviting people who speak a different language into your congregation, you might discover that you have really different theologies or really different class culture. So number of culture groups you work with well is a goal of folks in intercultural development. So we are going to see our results in a moment, but before we do, I need to tell you that if you haven't taken this instrument before, there's a little bit of a gotcha. And that is that this assessment both measures patterns in how you function, but also how your behavior suggests to other people how you function. They call this the perceived orientation. And there's language that they give, but what makes the most sense to me in describing this is there's a way I am in the world when I'm working with other people. But there's also all these clues that I give you about how good I am at this. Like, for instance, my name was the marquee in talking about it, right? So you would suspect that my competency was higher based on that, perhaps, right? Or if I told you about the cool intercultural books I'm reading, or how I'm working with a Dinka congregation and, another congregation, you might think, wow, she really knows what she's doing, right? So the reality is I'm actually just telling you about stuff I did, you don't know how good I am at it. The fact that I'm telling you is because I perceive myself as having a level of competence that I'm trying to show you. But I might not actually be that good at it. And if I'm not, there's a thing that is measured by this instrument called the orientation gap. And let me tell you, as somebody who's done a little bit of social science work, if you ask anyone how good they are at anything, they'll tell you they're better than they are. How good are you at texting while you're driving? How good are you at shopping when you're hungry and not spending all the money and buying all the sugary foods, right? We all think we're better at things than we are, and we have to. How could we go out into the world thinking we would fail? But when we show other people we have a higher level of intercultural competency than we do, the gap can hurt us and them. The gap is the place where we get into disagreements, and if we don't have the stuff to actually bridge that gap, we just get conflict, or we just stop trying. So there could be a gap in our results. Let's find out what our perceived orientation was and what our developmental orientation was. Sorry about that. I think the N was like 120. I didn't count it up though. So this was our perceived orientation, which was in acceptance. And that is an orientation in which people are curious and appreciative of other cultures. Our developmental orientation was in minimization. And this is an orientation that focuses on commonality, similarities, and universal values that sometimes might mask real important differences. And it's also true that in minimization, if you're part of majority culture, that might take the form of you really understanding the norm kind of implicitly and unconsciously, and really not paying attention to people that aren't a part of that. Yes?
So should we be trying to write these down or are they going to be sent out?
Well, we're going to do a thing in a minute that'll make that clear.
Okay.
This part is actually, so these results are aggregate results, which means this is everybody's result put together. So what we can use this for is like, I could guess how you would respond to a controversial resolution based on this. Not which side you would take, but I could guess based on this how the debate would go, actually. So these numbers, I guess what I would say is you can write, if you really care, you can write down the specific numbers, which were the perceived orientation was acceptance, 122.44. The developmental orientation was in minimization, 97.38. I actually think the big picture thing to notice is that there's a gap. And we should also notice where we fell in minimization, which was a little shy of 100, which would suggest that we're more focused on that first part of really understanding what our culture is as a diocese, who we are. That's the part we are still kind of cementing that. And when we get a little bit farther in our cultural self-understanding, the deep listening we've been doing, then we would start to be better at being curious and more confident in those conversations we're having with our neighbors. But that's only part of the story, because this is sort of just the overall median sort of numbers. Let's look at some more specific, because this might also help. So you have a blank chart on page 5 of your booklet. And this is a place I'd copy down these numbers. And if you're really watching, if you're like somebody who's really mathy, I'm so sorry. I couldn't make it exactly right. You'll know what I mean if you're one of those people.
Rounding error.
Yeah. I rounded by 5s, but it still comes out right. So this is a spread of orientations. So what we see here is that we have, yeah, it looks like a little bit of a bell curve, I think. So 3% of folks were both in denial and adaptation, which means the folks that kind of are on the extremes are in the smallest percentages. We'll notice too that while minimization is really more in polarization than acceptance. So it's what we call, it is a bell curve, but I'd say skewed a bit towards monocultural. Not a lot, but a little. So take a minute, record these. And just as a kind of, these percentages then are percentages of respondents. So this is where the big number, it describes how the whole group is. These individual percents, they're describing fractions of you.
What was your total population size again?
I think it was about 120. I can count it and get it to you tomorrow. I'm so sorry. When I pulled the note, it's like a big spreadsheet and I have to, So what I'd love for you to do, and we're gonna stop at, let's actually stop at, we can stop at 5. We can finish with talking. So there should be one more slide with a couple questions on it. So I give you a little bit of interpretation, but the reality is I'm not the best one to interpret your data. You are, because you're the ones who gave the responses, and you're the ones who this describes. So when you think about the results that you just recorded, I would love for you to talk for 10 minutes about what surprised you. And also, with your tables, do these results match your experiences as a leader in the Diocese of Spokane or your congregation? Because my hunch is they might. Is there any questions about the conversation? Okay, so this is very loose. We're just like having a free-flowing conversation. Yeah.
That set of numbers you just showed us, perceived or?
That's your developmental orientation. So that range of orientations, the bar graph that we recorded, that's our developmental orientation as a group. So it said that 60% or so, 63% were in minimization. So that's a description of the Diocese of Spokane delegates. Okay, so talk for about 10 minutes and I'll wrap us back up at the end. Hey, look at that. Nailed it.
Okay. Okay. There we go. This is a little bit better. Okay. Thank you again for engaging in that conversation. Before we close this session for the evening, I wanted to say something about that bell curve that you saw. Besides the fact that minimization occupies sort of two phases, so it, maybe is overrepresented in that scale, it's also true if you think about it, that that way of seeing the world is very consistent with tolerance regimes in our civil society and our church. So it wouldn't be a terrible surprise that a bunch of Americans governed by our Constitution that requires tolerance of other religions and cultures, also a church where we promise that we will respect the dignity of every human being, some essential single thing that every person has, not the rich differences that we evidence in creation, that it makes some sense that a group like that would mostly be in minimization. And I want to say too, it is not a bad place to be unless you have other work to do. So as you go out this night, remember that there are many skills that this group has. In fact, if we were doing an individual debrief, I would actually make you, poor people, read aloud the strength of minimization, which is that you have likely found success in interacting with people from different cultures when you can draw on commonalities and shared values. It's not a terrible thing. It's just not all there is to God's wondrous creation. So now I think we are going to switch gears, but we'll talk more about this tomorrow. Thank you all.
Thank you. That was a great start to our program. And we now are on break-ish. And why I say ish is part of the break is travel. Right? We're going to have evensong, glorious. One of the gifts of the Anglican Communion is the English choral tradition and evensong. And we're going to have evensong in the cathedral in the nave. So we'll need to go there for worship. As you go from this room to the nave, you'll pass several things. You'll pass bathrooms. That might or might not be important. You'll pass swag. We know that's important. Oh, sorry, shameless commerce. Shameless commerce. Supper is then back here, and as I said, the setup is going to be the buffet line for supper is in the guild room, which is my left, your right, depending on where you're looking. And we'd appreciate it if you don't have any food allergies, if you just hold back a little bit, so those with food allergies could go through the line first. After supper at 7:30, back in the nave, we'll be showing the movie The Philadelphia 11. It's only a 90-minute movie. It's really good.
Prelude will start about 5:25. Evensong shall not start early, because evensong shall start at the time when the choir and the officiant are ready and the call time has been set.
Yeah. So the prelude music, yeah. So the good thing is it's that clock is wrong, and I don't have my phone with me, and that actually makes sense to you that I just said that, right? 5:03. So we got about 25 minutes to get down there. So we're on recess to go to worship.